and there just needs to be an integration between the two agencies in that situation. So we resolved that one by and large through mediation. Council's position at the hearings. Just a couple of points here. So supported the overall approach in the unitary plan, but there was a policy distinction made between the sites of significance and the sites of value, in that for the sites of value, there was an approach of avoiding where practicable and otherwise remedy or mitigate adverse effects, whereas in terms of the sites of significance, and there were about 65 of those largely rolled over, the approach was still to avoid adverse effects on those sites of significance, but there was recognition in the RPS from the council that for the 3,600 sites, the purple circles essentially, avoid is the best approach, avoid any adverse effects, any damage, cultural or physical, but in some cases remedy or mitigate may be an appropriate alternative. And that's so no interim guidance on this chapter of the RPS.
They're obviously happy.
Okay, let's quickly move to sustainably managing our natural resources then.
Right, 7 sections in this chapter of the RPS, a very diverse range of topics from air quality through to freshwater quality and natural hazards. The notified plan sought to protect human health and the environment, so 2 key elements there in terms of air quality, in terms of the links to negative health effects and effects on the environment. It set a policy framework where freshwater quality and values are maintained, restored or enhanced where degraded, and sought to reduce risks from natural hazards and avoiding increasing risks to people and property from flood hazards, particularly for vulnerable activities, for example, housing. And this is where GMOs feature for the first time in the unitary plan. And it sought to manage the risks of trialling the release of GMOs, but essentially prohibiting or not allowing general release of GMOs into the environment. Where submitters were coming from on the natural resources chapter, I'm on the same page. Although infrastructure providers sought to better recognise that in some cases they have operational needs that require certain impacts on natural resources or need to use natural resources, and that they didn't feel that was recognised in the RPS that went out for submissions. Some sought better recognition of things like the NPS freshwater management. Some sought to amend priorities for the allocation and use of water and geothermal resources. For example, Federated Farmers, iwi, Watercare all had probably quite differing views on how water should be prioritised in terms of use and allocation. There was quite extensive mediation on that. Some submitters sought to either weaken or strengthen the natural hazard provisions. I guess those that were seeking to weaken them would prefer the policy phrase manage the risks from new development affected by potential natural hazards, and those that wanted to strengthen it wanted very much and avoid any impacts of development in areas that might be subject to flooding or coastal inundation, cliff erosion, a range of natural hazards. And some submitters sought greater recognition of the relationship of mana whenua to natural and physical resources. Council's position at the hearings, really it was probably more clarification than any major policy shifts, clarifying that water will be managed within limits, amendments proposed to clarify, providing clarity about implications of growth on water management and municipal water supply needs, and Watercare were quite extensively involved in the detailed policy wording of this, quite a technical part of the unitary plan. Additional consideration of mana whenua concerns regarding GMOs, which was missing from the plan as notified. Natural hazard risks shouldn't be increased and are reduced where possible, in contrast to reduce only. So there was a policy wording change there, and I guess the key driver for that was the arguments around the cost and practicality of not increasing risks at all. Of reducing risks at all times, rather than allowing for no increase in risk. and a more direct reference to the need to consider the effects of climate change, cumulative effects in the policies for natural hazards. No interim guidance from the panel on this chapter of the RPS.
Any questions? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Coast.
All right, we'll move on to coast. 4 sections.
Major mention of the Manukau coastline.
Major mention of the Manukau Harbour.
And the Kaipara.
And the
And the Kaipara.
Right, so we're going to have a separate presentation on the coastal plan chapter of the unitary plan shortly, so I'll probably race through this one fairly quickly. Sought to locate, use and develop in appropriate areas taking into account the values of the coast, concentrate development in areas that are already developed instead of new development in coastal areas, limit occupation of the coastal marine area to activities with a functional need to be there. I might flick the slide on. Provide for infrastructure and existing activities, sought to maintain and enhance public access to and along the coast, avoid degradation of areas with high water quality, and sought to protect the values of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act. And I guess that the reason why that's there is it does have its own specific legislation. Okay. Right, submitters. Main issue there was just greater recognition of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and what that might mean in terms of the objectives and policies for the coast in the RPS of the Unitary Plan. Greater recognition of the need to protect the coastal environment, greater recognition of water quality in the coastal areas, infrastructure, and the relationship of mana whenua with and to the coast. Council's position at the hearings. There were some amendments and some new policies to just be much clearer about the link to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. All of these points really are just about clarifying the wording, strengthening. It wasn't a change in approach to the coastal plan. It was really just a clarification and improvements to the wording. No interim guidance on the coastal chapter of the RPS. Right, next chapter, the rural chapter of the RPS, and there are 3 key elements to that. Rural activities that you might see in rural Auckland, what we might think about land with high productive potential, and the biggie, or probably the biggest one, that generates the most interest is subdividing rural land. In the notified plan, there was definitely a focus on rural activities in rural areas rather than, I guess, a range of urban activities starting to pop into rural Auckland, and the potential issues that you get when that happens in some places. Yes, sought to ensure rural production activities continue to make a significant contribution to the rural economy and not undermining that. Sought to retain elite and prime land, so there are 2 different categories that the soil specialists identified in terms of agricultural land, and the unitary plan sought to protect elite and prime land and minimise its loss through development subdivision. And a key point here, the last one, there was a preference for using existing sites rather than creating new sites through subdivision and encouraging amalgamation of those existing sites. There are tens of thousands of vacant lots in Auckland, in rural Auckland, large fragmentation, so the preference is to try and amalgamate and concentrate subdivision rather than allow for more widespread subdivision. Submitters' views. So many supported the approach for rural activities and rural subdivision. I think there probably is a point missing there, that there was a challenge to the restrictive approach to subdivision. So yes, there was support from some in the rural sector, but there were some rural landowners seeking more flexibility for rural subdivision on that first point. Again, the infrastructure providers were really strong on the RPS and strong on this chapter about the need to provide for infrastructure in rural areas. Some submitters concerned about the definition of elite and prime land, and I guess perhaps a preference for focusing just on the elite, not elite and prime. And some submitters sought environmental protection in exchange for rural subdivision. So if they're protecting some native vegetation of some significance on a rural property, there should be a benefit in allowing that property to be subdivided in exchange for protecting wetlands, native bush, and incentivising that protection. Council's position at the hearings, largely retaining the existing approach, still preference for protecting elite and prime land, amendments to strengthen the objectives and policies for rural character, amenity values, productivity and biodiversity, maintain that targeted approach to rural subdivision, so amalgamating sites and then transferring that subdivision potential into a countryside living area was still the preference, and some amendments to the wording in the RPS to deal with significant infrastructure in rural areas. There was some interim guidance from the panel on rural issues. This is probably not specifically on the RPS, but actually moving down into some of the subdivision rules. So the panel at that point in time, so this is middle of last year, felt that yes, there should be some discouragement of subdivision, but not prevented. So a signal that perhaps we had too restrictive an approach to rural subdivision was coming through from the panel. And the council did respond to this in the rural hearings, and we'll do a separate presentation on that at one of the subsequent meetings. The panel's guidance suggested that elite land should be protected, but they're silent on prime land. They talked about providing resilience from the effects of natural hazards in rural areas. They were supportive of the idea of protecting indigenous vegetation and having some subdivision benefit as a result of a landowner doing that. And rural lifestyle subdivision should be enabled, but constraints on where it might happen, the density, the size of the lots, and avoiding compromising the rub. So that was a flavour of what was coming through from the panel on rural. And the council's position, as I say, did adapt a little bit in response to this guidance, and we'll do a more detailed presentation on that at a later date. And we've got one more chapter to go, but any questions on rural?
Yep,
Can I-
Councillor Lee.
Yeah, can I just, my apologies, can I just rewind to the coastal section? I just want to address the Hauraki Gulf. I don't want to say how special and unique and it's my favourite place and that stuff. I want to point out that the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park also has an act, and it's rather subtle in that in three parts. The Hauraki Gulf is an entity and the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park is an entity, but I think the important thing that I'm not seeing emphasised here is that section 7 and 8 constitute a national policy statement and a New Zealand coastal policy statement. So it's not about how nice things are, but what is in the law, and I think that we need to give more recognition of that quite unique legislation rather than the nice place that it is and its values, etc., etc., etc. It's about the law.
Okay. Noted. Mr Baker.
No, I'm all right. You can wait till that next presentation.
Cool.
You say Councillor Baker.
I could.
It's always, no, he's honorary, isn't he?
Would you like to bestow that?
Yeah, Thomas.
That honour?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Look,
honorary too.
I tell you, if we could just
to
organise
be here,
things
George.
from here, it may work out very, very well, but we
Okay.
can't, unfortunately.
Okay.
Last chapter, climate change.
Okay, climate change doesn't have one of those lovely little